Beverly, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me on the program.
So, for several years now, we've been getting this kind of drip of news reports about Russia building up its military presence in Africa, usually through this shadowy private security company, the Wagner Group, which for about a year now has operated under a new name and command as Africa Corps. Can you start by giving us an overview of how long Russia has been getting involved in conflict situations in Africa, what exactly it's been doing, and where it's been doing it?
Well, Russia has been in the region since post-independence, so they were very integral to supporting independent movements as well as governments that were emerging after they had, shone off colonialism. And then now more contemporary Russian involvement has involved defense and military operations, particularly through the Wagner Group and now the Africa Corps. Core countries where they are is Sudan, mostly the western region, which is being currently run by a paramilitary force because it's at war. They happen in the Central African Republic over the north and the eastern regions where there are rebel forces there at the behest of the government, the Central African Republic government. They are in Mali, where they have been involved in active operations in the northern region, but also in the central and parts of the west and south. A few other forces were sent to Niger and Burkina Faso, primarily to be training security forces, but also giving regime protection. These are all countries that are active war zones. They are facing rebels or militants or even just interfighting between armies. So they are not just providing military support on the front line, but also training and protecting the leaders of those countries because they're the ones who have requested Russian presence to that scale.
So you mentioned the operation in the Central African Republic, and that was launched back in 2018. And I believe it's kind of held up as a bit of a model of how Russia operates in Africa. Why is it seen as a model, and how is it supposed to really work?
Well, initially, Central African Republic requested the UN Security Council for stabilization support, and Russia was one of the first to put its hand up and say they would be able to provide military aid and other forms of aid, diplomatic support for them to stabilize after civil war. Now, what happened is initially there were military instructors who were sent to the countries with handfuls of guns, handheld guns, which were supposed to be used to train the local army so that they could fight rebel forces that had been undermining the government's presence in the northern and eastern regions. But then over time, it diversified beyond just military support. It was military support in exchange for mineral concessions. The Wagner Group over the years established economic networks and companies through which they could then use as a front to be able to trade minerals. It moved on to timber, sometimes even cattle, across the border in Cameroon, and allegations that some of that was being moved through the port of Douala. There was also a very robust media and disinformation campaign. A lot of it targeted Central African Republic's Western partners, primarily France, which had a fairly poor record over allegations of sexual assault by some of its forces. So they capitalized on that to try to fuel anger and discontent against the West. So they were operating with the government, sometimes with even the ruling party youths and the CAR. They were providing close protection to not just the president, but also key government infrastructure. There were instances where they were involved in customs and regulating customs as a way of generating revenue. And that became a model for Russian paramilitary involvement, such that they became a self-sustaining force. Of course, they had a central command, which was in Russia, a member who was very close to the Kremlin, but not really a government official. His name was Evgeny Prigozhin. And because of this sort of semi-autonomous way of operating, they built a robust empire where they were able to consolidate funds to purchase equipment, to be able to still get support from the Russian Defense Ministry. And for a long time, Russia officially denied this. But if you look at that, economy, diplomatic, military, and then you also have a media campaign which allows you to gain public resonance, it meant that Russia and even the Wagner Group had a much wider resonance beyond the CAR, such that they were able to influence some of their deployments in the Sahel.
I mean, you mentioned minerals, access to very lucrative minerals. You also mentioned propaganda against rival countries. How much do we know about what Russia sees as in it for them in Africa? Why are they doing this? Is it primarily about the economy? Is it primarily about sort of strategic, diplomatic games that they have going on? What's the goal here?
I mean, for a long time, it often felt like Russia was trying to distance itself from some of the operations by the Wagner campaigners, including Prigozhin himself. But Prigozhin used to state often that he was doing it for Russia to be able to have a strong foothold in the region at a time when it was losing its credibility, considering the actions in Crimea much earlier and then later on the war in Ukraine. It was a way for Russia to also demonstrate that it is a geopolitical partner that can compete with the West in a region where France, the EU, the US has had so much economic, military, and diplomatic influence. But if you really think about it, Russia has not been able to provide as much aid, for instance, as say the US to the region or even the EU, which continue to be the leading aid partners despite, strategic realignments around that. Russia would mostly posture, and the Wagner Group was very good at posturing this. They would tease out campaigns whereby they would demonstrate that France was, for instance, a rat that was eating the resources of Sahel countries, and a Wagner mercenary comes in and beats up this rat and is seen to be saving the people of the Sahel from something that is taking advantage of their resources. And this played up so much that it did disrupt Western presence. And it did make the West feel like it was losing a foothold, even though there was still some resonance towards the West being here. Russian campaigns mostly capitalize on existing sentiment against the West rather than propelling or being the ones that are creating that sentiment. And that's part of the underlying success. It's very easy to co-opt that and make it have public messaging. This is also an age where social media is growing in the region. It doesn't have as much reach because if you think about how much internet and electricity there is versus how many people are able to actually access it, it's disproportionately urban. It's disproportionately aligned with some of the growing military political class. But it did have an impact on dislodging some Western presence and raising those grievances against the West and allowing Russia to then establish itself as a military and diplomatic partner in the region.
They may be trying to present themselves as saviors, but the reality seems to be quite different to that. I mean, there have been plenty of reports of human rights violations involving Russian fighters in Africa. What kind of allegations are we talking about?
So in many instances, there are allegations of abuses during counterinsurgency operations. In Mali, these have been a lot more prevalent. One of the most stark examples had been in Mura in the central region, where it was alleged that over a period of 5 days, Russian paramilitaries and Malian forces were involved in rounding up civilians and sometimes summarily executing them over allegations that they were affiliated with militant groups. And these patterns of violence have been seen in parts close to the border with Mauritania, sometimes in the northern regions where the army in Mali has been trying to ensure that it has a sense of national consolidation of its territory. In other instances, there have been allegations of them either training or recruiting people who are underage in the Central African Republic, particularly during the period where rebel groups were being asked to give up their arms and to either be moved into the armed forces or sometimes being trained to fight alongside the Russian paramilitaries. There have been documents by rights groups in the Central African Republic about disproportionately targeting by Russian paramilitaries of members of the Fulani community, members of the Muslim community, many of whom may have affiliations with the rebel groups, mostly intercommunal links rather than real political or military affiliations. And the fact that there hasn't really been an inquiry, and even these governments, they tend to downplay this or deny them altogether. If anything, they tend to become quite antagonistic, particularly with the UN and other rights agencies for such reports. But these continue to be documented, even actively up until today. Robust media outlets like the French media would be reporting it. Sometimes that is seen as still favoring a Western perception of how Russia is involved in the region. But there are still active accounts of rights abuses, attacks, sexual assault, pillaging sometimes, and summary executions, and sometimes just arbitrary detentions of people.
And does the fact that Russia has largely been using, mercenaries, these troops who are not really officially part of the state, does that make it even harder to hold them to account for potential abuses than if they were sending conventional soldiers?
Well, yes, it does, because there has been that distance between what is the line of command for Russian paramilitaries and then where you draw the line with how they cooperate with the government. And the government's own lack of acknowledgement, for instance, in Mali, whereby they stand by the fact that they have a handful of instructors who are supporting their armed forces. In the CAR, even though they become a lot more, I mean, they're more prominent, they are seen beside the president. But because there have been also allegations that paramilitaries tend to override the command of the national forces, it makes it very difficult for there to be an instance where a court or maybe a military tribunal would be able to hold them account for those allegations. And we haven't seen, for instance, efforts by the International Criminal Court, because it would probably put them in a slightly awkward position, even though the ICC is actively pursuing the Russian president over Ukraine. So it would require continued documentation of some of these allegations and perhaps a more concerted effort by international agencies for this to then be brought to account, as with similar instances of civil war within the region.
Almost all reports about Russia's influence in Africa mention that the core of their tactic is, quote unquote, filling the void. Could you explain what that void is and why it occurs?
So between 2020 up until now, there have been a series of military coups, starting off in Mali, Burkina Faso, Niger, and a few other countries. These coups were triggered initially by political mismanagement, but also a very heightened sense of insecurity. These are countries that are with active Al-Qaeda, Islamic State militants, and other rebel groups that are operating. In 2013 and 2012, France brought in thousands of troops to try and roll back the insurgency. So they were deployed initially in northern Mali. They were able to pull back the militant forces and allow the army to secure territory. But over the years, this insurgency has spread. So from northern Mali towards the central region, by 2017, the Al-Qaeda group had become quite a big alliance involving other active armed groups in the central region of Mali. By 2015, the insurgency had spread into Burkina Faso and Niger. The force by France increased to a 5,000-strong force, which was now spread across the region all the way up until Chad. There are other French forces in the region who are providing training and support, but the core mission of the Sahel mission was to be able to counter militant violence. And this was seen as having failed. So by the time the coups were taking place, these military governments were now aligning their sentiment with the public to say that French forces and other Western forces, including the UN, the EU Takuba force, should leave. And they did leave eventually, including the US in 2024 September. Now, Russian paramilitaries were invited because people had seen their apparent prowess in the Central African Republic just before the 2020 election. They pushed back rebels, an election was held, President Touadéra was re-elected. People felt that this is the kind of force that was needed in the Sahel to be able to fight back militants. But there were not as many. In Mali, there are just about 2,000, which is half of the number of French forces. The G5 Sahel was another localized force being supported by France. It collapsed. There were 5,000 others. The UN had about 13,000 personnel, primarily in Mali. That was also forced to leave. So Russia does say that it is filling that void. But in terms of capacity, it is much less, even with the training and the kind of equipment that they have been sending to the Sahel in recent years.
And in terms of how Russia's behavior compares to France, I find it really interesting watching this from France. You see this former colonial power still being very much present there, and then a different country, Russia, stepping in. What are the perceptions in these countries of how Russia is behaving? Do they see Russia as behaving very differently to the former colonial power France, or are there actually quite big similarities in terms of how they're behaving?
I mean, I suppose the big difference is there is a growing resentment, or there has been a growing resentment towards France because of its very long links from the colonial period. And even though it seemed like the natural security partner at the time when the insurgency started off, and they were initially successful, which still won them support, the fact that that strategy did not evolve to match the demands of people, for instance, negotiating with militants is one thing, or being able to actually be a fighting force, being able to provide air support. meant that the resentment was even more. And the prevalence is there because people are speaking French. People do see French colonial names in their streets, on their buildings. They still follow a French legal system, French education system. So that trying to pull itself away from that is part of trying to identify, to try to build some sense of sovereignty. Now, Russia has in some ways co-opted that sense of sovereignty. It has tried to support politically and militarily these emerging governments in the Sahel, the military governments. They have given them what feels like strategic support in areas where they really need it. So when those coups took place and Russian flags were being waved, the feeling was that there was a lot of public support or national support towards Russia. It's hard to get nuanced opinions because these are also countries where it's often very difficult for you to have an alternate view publicly, and criticism towards the government is not seen very kindly. So in some sense, Russia is seen as trying to support liberation efforts because they have actually given these armies the equipment that they needed and the training that they needed to be able to fight insurgents in a way that French was seen to be holding back on that. They have allowed these armies to take the lead in how the operations will take place, irrespective of concerns about human rights abuses or about what that means for, social cohesion or even backing for the army. So Russia is also capitalizing on this by trying to get more people to learn the Russian language. So the cultural center that has been established in Burkina Faso, or other Russian language efforts in Mali, and the Central African Republic with a radio station where there are Russian language lessons alongside what's happening at the university. So making it well-rounded, so to speak, such that they have a lot of resonance. In the CAR, you will find people wearing T-shirts of the Wagner Group, or what is now the Africa Corps, which tries to show that they do have a lot of public resonance. Whether that actually trickles across the country is a very different picture, and it's very hard to often tell. For communities that do find themselves subjected to violence by militant groups, not so much. And they'd probably rather have a stable government that does not lean too much on any foreign power, Russia or France, the US or anyone else, as a way of stabilizing. But for these governments, they owe a lot to Russia now. And they feel that they need to dislodge France's influence, only that now it's being dislodged through another power. So the question of sovereignty also feels like it's in flux.
I found Emmanuel Macron's take on all of this quite interesting. He suggested there was a lack of gratitude in these countries where French forces had been had spent quite a lot of resources. I see you laughing already.
It didn't go well. It didn't. I mean, it's awkward because the announcement came when there were all of these other announcements by, say, Senegal, Chad, Cote d'Ivoire, that French forces were leaving. And it was a very different kind of announcement from the Sahel, where it was acrimonious. It was like late night bulletins where the government spokesman goes on air and says, France has been terrible and this and that, and we want them to leave. And I think Macron and the French government has sort of held on to that. And that has felt like the viewpoint through which these conversations about French presence are now being approached. And then on the flip side, Senegal was also, talking about this in context with the Chiaroya massacre, whereby French forces were accused of killing West African forces who were demanding their wages and better pay. And this was a massacre that no one talked about. The number of people who were killed has never really been known. And even though France has tried to make some efforts towards opening the archives for people to access that and to investigate, and stopped short of an apology about a decade ago, it still hasn't been resolved. So when he said that, the Prime Minister of Senegal, for instance, shared an image of, some of the forces in Chiaroye and said, have you been thankful for this? And it became its own point of discourse. France was never going to be here forever, realistically speaking. And it's only that the insurgency has changed in such a way that had not really been fully considered. The recent wave of coups, yes, in retrospect, they were coming. How they have changed diplomatic relations has been quite devastating and very, very sudden. But France was supposed to eventually leave. Cote d'Ivoire was announcing the departure of French forces based on mutual terms and conditions. So that was not a surprise. Chad is always an interesting, it's a bit of a wild card. Chad did it because they were not happy with what the French minister had said, but there were plans for France to leave. And with Senegal, with the current government, they're very nationalist, they're very sovereigntist, and they were definitely going to question why French forces need to be in the country because there's no real insurgency here. And they may be trying to support the efforts near the border with Mali, but Senegal is in a better place and would not really need that much and can calibrate its own relationship. But overall, France is not having a very good record within the region.
Moving on from France, I wonder whether we could talk about the US for a bit. Seems like the freeze of US AID might create yet another void that's waiting to be filled. Do you think Africa Corps, Russia will seize this opportunity? And if so, what can it do with it? What will it want to do with that?
Interestingly, I would say no, because even before that happened, Russia was trying to restructure the Wagner Group under Africa Corps. So when Prigozhin died, the founder of the Wagner Group, the feeling was that it was a very autonomous movement or a group. It felt like it was a separate center of power from the Kremlin and needed to be brought back under the Kremlin to be able to sort of do its bidding. So at the moment, there seem to be negotiations under how the Africa Corps will then absorb Wagner paramilitaries and try to diversify those sources. And the African Corps seems to be less willing to do some of the, propaganda that the Wagner Group used to do, or even some of the diplomatic outreach. The Deputy Defense Minister of Russia has been in the region. He was in Mali, he was in CAR, he was briefly in Nigeria to speak to Russian officials there. But part of it is how to recalibrate their presence and to focus on the Africa Corps, presumably as a purely training force. So as you can see, that gap will not be filled. And USAID wasn't doing much in security. That was the State Department. The USAID was doing health, education, energy. It was supporting, civil society groups. This support is now going to drastically reduce. And it's probably going to mean that in the short term, there will be disruptions to basic services. But in the long term, it's going to aggravate social and economic inequalities. In Mali, USAID was funding schools across all of its 9 regions, the school feeding program, the training of teachers, the provision of facilities. In Burkina Faso, there are displaced people across the country, and USAID was providing, water, medication, training, tracking of diseases, and surveillance generally of the health of displaced populations. Russia can only give very little. Russia tried to support, efforts towards either dengue fever in Burkina Faso. There wasn't really much traction from that. In Mali, beyond providing Russian lessons, it hasn't quite said it's going to provide a robust education scheme. And even in Niger, where it's a lot more devastating in terms of humanitarian and social services, Russia hasn't quite postured its way in that way. They're trying to sign a, friendly nuclear use agreement within the region. But even the way that nuclear energy can be harnessed in a conflicted environment is quite difficult. So there's going to still be a huge gap between what the West, the US, was providing in aid and what Russia can actually give in terms of monetary aid beyond just military equipment and military forces.
When we zoom out, Beverly, and look at how Russia is doing generally in Africa right now, do you see it as broadly being successful in its African operations right now, or are there signs that it is maybe overstretched, especially at a time when it's already, of course, fighting another very, very expensive, complicated war in Ukraine?
At the very start, it seemed to have an upper hand. It had Syria as well, which essentially has now sort of been lost or is in limbo. And it was able to use that as a sort of strategic base to then redeploy resources across the region. And yes, there have been instances in Burkina Faso where they had to redeploy Russian paramilitaries towards the Ukrainian front, which sort of kind of left it slightly more vulnerable than it was. By and large, I think Russia has won in some narrative wars, especially when you look at the Twitter accounts of some of its embassies across the region. I think the most active are the Kenyan and the South African. Whoever it is who does the Twitter or X, they really sort of do a good job at rattling other embassies. I think there was one time the South African one was engaging with the German South African embassy, and it felt like a war of words. it was a very strange thing to see, but it's a very, very, 21st century type of spat taking place on social media. I think there was some contention about, Nazism and all of that, which was playing out on the African Twitter accounts of their diplomatic missions. In terms of being able to upset Western presence, I think Russia would see that as quite a success. When the Ukraine war broke out, people were lobbying African countries to support the resolution. Quite a number of them abstained. Quite a number voted in favor. And everyone forgot about the countries that voted in favor, which were an overwhelming 20 or so. Everyone focused on the abstentions, which demonstrates how much there's so much geopolitical contestation within the region. And where the West is using its foothold, it's not just Russia that's capitalizing. It's, Turkey, it's China, it's the United Arab Emirates. They are becoming the preferred partners or the emerging partners in the region. So I think the West has a lot more to worry about, so to speak, geopolitically than Russia. Russia will continue to, play that up in whatever way it can. They will remember Africa Day and they will all tweet about it in collective. They will give Russian free lessons. I did A1 Russia by courtesy of the Russian embassy in Kenya. It was for free via Zoom.
Wow.
And
That's
only
nice.
I was intrigued because I got tired of trying to beg members of the Russia team to translate things for me. And I just needed to find Mali and CAR in posts and, sort out my life. But that's the sort of thing that they are doing. And because it's playing out on social media, sometimes it feels a bit hyperbolic. The West is still seen as a benchmark for many things. We watch more Hollywood films and Hollywood series. I have Netflix, and that's what most people will have. In fact, the moment Netflix was open to the rest of Africa, every one of us was rushing to subscribe to it, right? And even if RT, for instance, is trying to build a media footprint in the region, it may not have the same resonance as, say, CNN or BBC, because those are known as trustworthy sources because of not just, them being in the West, but because they've had a long time of operating. So it really depends on how you look at it. Diplomatically, yes, if you're in the UN, Russia has, they've been able to really upset Western dominance, the UN Security Council and the UN plenary itself. But in terms of other things like culture, music, language, I think there will still be a lot more of French, English, German, Arabic in places that there would be Russian for now.
I'm conscious of how weird and depressing it is that when we talk about Africa's place in the world, years and years after independence, we're still talking about who's trying to be influential there. How does it feel as an African to see China and Russia and Europe still so greedily eyeing the continent's resources so long after independence?
I don't even know if it's a failure in quotes of African states, but more like a leadership issue, I think, because there's a lot of innovation coming from people who are just living on the continent that goes unacknowledged, especially by governments. I think yesterday I came across a post of people there's a company in Cameroon where they're building drones to be able to deliver medical supplies. And by contrast, in Rwanda, there's a program that was being supported by USA to deliver medication by drones. And it just tells you that there are places where we can have internal resilience if we just tapped better into our own resources. I think looking at the African Union Summit, for instance, which, tends to be the place where you see all the leaders come together to make decisions that should be impacting me and other people living on the continent, it was disappointing, for instance, that there was no consolidated statement on how do African countries improve their own bilateral networks in light of the withdrawal of American aid or of possibly European aid in the long run. Some things work, some things don't. It's really a leadership issue. And that is what allows global powers, so to speak, to then think that this is a place where they can scramble. But I suppose it's idealistic, of course, if African countries decided they were going to build their own infrastructure across regions and really open up internal roads and, cooperation that is more practical, pragmatic. I exchange my cocoa for you to give me, your coffee and so on and so forth. There might be more to go around. But I think as long as there's a leadership crisis overall, then we will always be at the mercy of foreign states. It will always be at the mercy of geopolitical contests rather than just having more internal resolve to be able to sort out conflicts, to be able to deal with interregional crisis, to be able to trade more efficiently, especially when we've been fronting things like the Africa Free Trade, agreement, the biggest trade platform after the WTO and things like that. It's mostly a failure of leadership rather than the global powers themselves.
Great. Well, that was excellent. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you as well.
Such a clear talker. So, yeah, we really appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you.